video, we'll be discussing a little bit about the Supreme Court, understanding it, and kind of mulling your way through the information that's given out in modern times. So this is another add-on video to our lecture series. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is that students walk away from this class and other classes I teach with a better understanding of the Supreme Court, or SCOTUS as we call it, Supreme Court of the United States. Because Supreme Court is not as well known as some of the other branches. Their arguments aren't televised. We don't have the same kind of record on them that we might have of other politicians. And yes, I said politicians because despite the fact that they are legal scholars, they certainly are politicians in different ways. We just don't have the same type of material on them that we have on other kinds of elected officials or selected or appointed officials. And yet they have such a huge influence on our political system. So it's important to better understand the role of the Supreme Court in the United States. And certainly that's what we've been doing the past couple of weeks here while we talk about the judiciary. Now, I want to kind of dispel a few myths along the way here. The first, and is, I think, probably the most important, and that is that the Supreme Court is the only court to watch. That is certainly not the case. If you remember from last week, the Supreme Court takes less than 1% of all the cases that come to its front door. That means that on a federal level alone, there are 99% of the cases out there that influence your life and my life and how government functions that are not making their way to the Supreme Court for full argument. Now, it is nearly impossible to keep your eye on all of the courts at one point in time, even if we're just talking all of the federal courts, right? Because in addition to the Supreme Court, we have the circuit court level where there is a lot of important policy-driven law being made on a daily basis. And then the district courts, which are hearing cases, making determinations that are both legal and factual on an ongoing basis. So the fact that the Supreme Court gets so much attention is probably because it's one way in which we can focus our attention on the judicial system and not have to understand everything at every court. But then that also neglects one really big group of courts, the biggest group of courts, which is the group that includes all of the state courts, whether that's just here in Michigan or across the country. These state courts make important policy and law decisions on a daily basis, really on an hourly basis, and they're doing this round the clock with search warrants, arrest warrants, and so on. And we have to understand the Supreme Court in its role with these other courts, which is to oversee what gets done in terms of the federal Constitution. So, with that being said, let's talk about where you can go to find more information about the courts. Probably my favorite source of updated daily information is SCOTUS blog. You can find their information a multitude of ways. The first is just by going to their website. They have a ton of information up here. You can just preview what's coming up. They do a lot of argument previews, brief previews, etc. They do blog posts on a daily basis. And then you can scroll down and look at this term's cases and pull up a case, like the Timms case, which is a big one that came up in Indiana about whether the Eighth Amendment that includes cruel and unusual punishment as well as excessive bail, whether the excessive bail part applies to the states. You can click on this, find the opinion if an opinion has been already announced and submitted. You can look at the briefs, and you can also look at analysis that gets done. So they'll link back to all those blog pages and sometimes external blog pages and analysis that gets done about these cases. This is by far the best collection of Supreme Court activity in terms of analysis and court watching from a high and usually academic and high legal standard. So it's very trustworthy in that sense. You can also pull up the briefs and read through them. You can listen to audio or read transcripts from the oral arguments. Other sites that are helpful, oyez.org, OYEZ. This is a repository of all the Supreme Court cases that have ever existed, cases that have been accepted, that have had their petition for cert granted, of course, are in here and have been argued and all of that. If you are looking up a Supreme Court case, this is a great place to go. You can find a summary. You can sort the justices by ideology or by how they decided the case. I kind of like making them dance back and forth a little bit. And that could tell you some really interesting things right off the bat. So if you're looking historically rather than kind of contemporarily, this is a really good source for you as well. On Twitter, there are a lot of good places to go. Anyone who writes for SCOTUS blog is a great place to follow, but there are certainly other legal scholars that are out there on Twitter that have really useful feeds. I know that can be sometimes hard to say about Twitter, that it's useful, but there are places that are useful. So if you search for the people who write for SCOTUS blog, you use the SCOTUS blog, their own Twitter handle to go out, that's another place as well. So I want to talk for a minute about why the mass media gets the Supreme Court wrong. And I don't mean all the time, and I don't mean that they don't make correct analysis at times or correct guesses as to what is going to happen. A lot of times these guesses are informed by legal scholars, but by and large they pick people who talk well on TV and not people who necessarily are the best in terms of providing analysis on the Supreme Court. That isn't to say that all media outlets are created equal. Certainly there are some that are better than others. I would argue that PBS is probably one of the best if you're Supreme Court watching. CNN isn't actually that bad because they have Jeffrey Toobin, and he does a fairly decent job and understands the court in its historical perspective as well. That said, a couple of things. One is that people just fail to realize that the Supreme Court is also a political entity, and they ignore some of the political realities that influence it. So they either kind of think of it in that, heavy legal sense that we talked about this week, or they just don't have a frame of reference to place it amongst the other institutions. And so a lot of it comes down to the 5-4 decisions or the 6-3 decisions, the really controversial ones, and it comes down to kind of those end of the year decisions as well, where you see the Supreme Court interns and whatnot running across the lawn and the media outlets and all of that, or up and down the steps. That is not to say that those things aren't important. They are. But a lot of the Supreme Court cases are decided in ways that you probably don't realize. Number one, there are a lot of unanimous decisions or close to unanimous decisions. Number two is that if you watch the court, you start to understand that there are some different types of relationships on the court on different issues. So, we hear a lot about Ginsburg and Scalia and their kind of famous friendship, but we don't tend to hear things like Neil Gorsuch and Sonia Sotomayor having somewhat similar views on Fourth Amendment issues and criminal justice issues. We don't tend to hear the ways in which the justices connect. We do hear about the ways in which they disconnect, and we tend to focus on that middle decider, which makes sense given some of the research, but also probably needs a more in-depth analysis to really make it work. All right, finally, I'll do a little predicting, analyzing of my own. I don't think they're putting me on CNN anytime soon, but we'll do it anyhow. So, one of the things that I get asked a lot by students and frankly other faculty and just people in general knowing my background is, what do I think is going to happen with the Supreme Court? And the answer is none of us truly know, but I do think a few things are going to happen and have started to happen that kind of confirm those beliefs. So, one of them is that Chief Justice Roberts, is going to do two things. One is he's going to be very guarded about the role of the court and hesitant to jump into legal battles that are really political battles if they can avoid it. Chief Justice Roberts does not want this court, the Roberts Court, with his name on it and all, to be thought of as a highly political and perhaps unjustifiably so entity. He would rather see it in the legal model. He would rather see the court be respected for its role in society, and he's very much worried about the public perception of the court and the long-term historic perception of the court. So, what does that mean? He's going to find ways to sometimes reject more controversial cases. If he can, he's going to find ways to ensure that issues are limited, maybe, when they do accept cases. He's going to find ways at times to accept more cases that get you those 9081 7-2 decisions that are less controversial. That also means at times he may play the role of a Kennedy or an O'Connor and be a swing vote. Is he going to be reliable on certain issues the way O'Connor was on reproductive choice? You could understand where she would fall on an abortion issue, or where Kennedy fell on issues related to same-sex marriage. No, the fact is that he doesn't have, at least as of now, one issue or two issues where he seems to be developing a middle-of-the-road jurisprudence. That said, he's probably going to try and take the middle of the road more often than not, just to balance the court. Unless it's an overwhelming case or something he feels strongly about, that's going to be his role. On the other hand, you're going to see more conservative justices feel that they can be even more conservative at times, and by the same token, you're going to see liberal justices feel like they can be more liberal, because if you're going to always fall into the dissenting ranks, why not? Which, in fact, is how Justice Ginsburg became so reliably liberal. She actually was quite a moderate justice until she just always fell in the dissenting ranks, and that somewhat solidified her role as the dissenter in chief. So I think the future of the Roberts Court has yet to be written. We don't really know a whole lot about how Kavanaugh is going to play out on the court. Gorsuch tends to pick his battles, and as I said before, has found some common ground with Sotomayor and Kagan on certain issues. So I would anticipate that to continue. And I would anticipate Roberts to still play that mediating role and looking out for the historical and political relevance of the court in public opinion, as far as that goes. So there are my 2 cents for what they are worth. If you have contacts at CNN and they really need someone to come argue with Jeffrey Toobin, I'm your gal. Otherwise, I will leave this add-on post where it's at, and we can certainly talk more on Twitter, email, or in person in office hours if that's an option for you. I will see you soon online and maybe elsewhere as well.